Her sister grabbed the microphone, smiled at the crowd, and said, "And of course, we all know Ariana tried to catch the bouquet, but it slipped right through her fingers, just like everything else in her life." The ballroom erupted. 300 people, senators, hedge fund managers, old money wives dripping in diamonds. They all laughed. Not politely, not awkwardly. They laughed. The kind of laugh that has teeth in it. Ariana Hale stood in the middle of that ballroom in a burgundy dress she'd spent 4 months saving for, and she smiled. Not because anything was funny. She smiled because she had learned a very long time ago that if you let them see you bleed, they never stop cutting. But her hand, hidden in the folds of her dress, was already reaching for the phone. If you've ever been the person everyone laughs at instead of laughs with, if you've ever stood in a room full of people who are supposed to love you and felt completely, utterly alone, then this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. And if you've never felt that way, keep watching. Because what happens next will remind you exactly what kind of person you never want to become. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, like it, share it. Let someone else know they're not alone. Now, let's go back to that wedding. The Hale family had always been good at appearances. That was the thing Ariana understood better than anyone, because she had spent 34 years watching her mother construct a version of reality that had very little to do with what was actually true. Eleanor Hale could walk into a room with a broken heart and a maxed-out credit card and somehow make every person in that room believe she was the most enviable woman alive. It was a talent, a cruel, exhausting, deeply practiced talent, and she had passed it directly to Celeste. Ariana had not inherited it. What Ariana had inherited was her father's ability to see numbers, patterns, the way money moved when people thought no one was looking. She turned that into a career site, forensic accounting, the kind of work that didn't make for exciting dinner conversation, but had quietly made her indispensable to 3 federal investigations over the past 6 years. She could look at a financial statement and see the lie hiding inside it, the way some people could look at a painting and see the brushstroke underneath. She was very, very good at her job. She was also, according to her family, an embarrassment, not because of anything she had done, because of the way she looked, because she was full-figured in a family that treated thinness like a moral virtue, because she wore practical shoes and kept her hair simple and never quite managed the effortless elegance that Celeste seemed to produce without trying. "You have such a pretty face," her mother had told her once, when Ariana was 11 years old. Once. As if that were a complete sentence. The wedding had been Celeste's idea of a coronation. 300 guests, a venue that cost more per hour than most people made in a month, flowers imported from somewhere that required an explanation Ariana had stopped listening to halfway through. The groom was Preston Whitmore III. Yes, the third. He mentioned it frequently. Whose family had made their fortune in real estate development and whose smile had the specific, polished quality of a man who had been told his whole life that he was exceptional. Ariana had met him 4 times before the wedding day. Each time he had looked at her the way people look at furniture. Present. Unremarkable. Easily overlooked. She had noted that. Filed it away. She filed a lot of things away. She had driven herself to the wedding, which was the first small indignity. Everyone else had arrived in hired cars. Ariana had parallel parked her own sedan 2 blocks away and walked, and by the time she reached the venue, her feet already hurt, and the evening hadn't even started. Her mother met her at the entrance, took one look at her and said, "Is that what you're wearing?" "Yes, Mom." "It's fine." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that it was not fine. "Celeste is going to be so beautiful tonight. Come inside before the photographers see you standing here." That was the second indignity. There were 37 more before the microphone moment. Ariana kept count. Not out of bitterness. She'd moved past bitterness somewhere around her 28th birthday. But because counting was how she processed things. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't have favorites. 37 moments in which she was either ignored, gently maneuvered away from a photograph, or made the subject of a joke that everyone laughed at except her. The seating arrangement had put her at table 14, which was as far from the main table as the room's geometry allowed without actually placing her in the kitchen. Her table mates were 2 of Preston's distant cousins who spent the entire dinner talking to each other across her. A woman named Barbara, who was very interested in her own recent kitchen renovation, and an elderly gentleman who fell asleep during the salad course and remained asleep through the entree. Ariana had eaten her meal quietly, checked her phone twice for work emails, old habit, she couldn't help it, and watched the room. She was always watching rooms. It was professional instinct by now, the same reflex that made her notice when numbers didn't add up. People in rooms had patterns too, who deferred to whom, who watched the doors, who smiled with their mouth but not their eyes. Preston Whitmore smiled a lot that night, but every time Ariana looked at him, his eyes were doing a calculation she couldn't quite read. Not the calculation of a happy groom, something tighter, something with a deadline attached to it. She noticed. She didn't say anything, not yet. The toast began around 9 o'clock. Preston's best man, a broad-shouldered, loud-laughing man named Carter Dale, who had the energy of someone who had peaked in college and spent the subsequent 15 years refusing to accept it, took the microphone first. Carter Dale was the reason Ariana's dress now had a small red wine stain on the lower hem. It had happened earlier, during cocktail hour, in a moment that Carter would later claim was accidental. He turned around fast with a glass in his hand, he said. Didn't see her standing there. The wine went down and to the left and caught the bottom of her dress, and Carter had looked at the stain and then looked at her and said, with a grin that never reached the level of an actual apology, "Oh, did I get you?" "Yes," Ariana had said. "Sorry about that." He'd already turned back to his conversation. She had gone to the restroom and blotted the stain with a damp cloth and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Her reflection looked back. Steady, tired, very, very tired. She didn't cry. She had learned in her early 20s that crying in event restrooms solved nothing and ruined mascara. Instead, she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her therapist had taught her, back when she still had a therapist. "You don't owe anyone your pain," the therapist had said. "Keep it. It belongs to you." She went back out to the party. Carter Dale, with the microphone in his hand and 300 people watching, had the air of a man who had been waiting for exactly this audience his whole life. His toast meandered through college stories about Preston, a series of jokes that were funnier to him than to anyone else, and eventually arrived, as Ariana had somehow, with a sinking certainty, known it would, at her table. "And I know we've all had a chance to meet the lovely Hale family tonight," Carter said, his grin widening. Celeste, obviously, who is absolutely stunning. Applause, cheers, Celeste beaming, and of course their parents, Richard and Eleanor, who I understand are just thrilled about this union. More applause. Then the pause. The specific pause that meant something ugly was coming. And Ariana, who, well, he laughed first, which gave permission to everyone else, who we're all very glad made it to the dancing portion of the evening. The laughter that followed was the kind that lands in your chest and stays there. Ariana did not move. She sat at table 14 and kept her face entirely composed, and the only thing that happened, the only thing that anyone paying extremely close attention might have noticed, was that her left hand slipped beneath the tablecloth and pressed once, firmly, against the inside of her wrist. An old self-steadying gesture, something she'd done since childhood. Then Celeste took the microphone and made her joke about the bouquet, and the room erupted. Ariana smiled. She stood up from table 14 with her clutch in hand and her wine-stained hem dragging slightly on the floor, and she moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility she'd spent a lifetime developing. People parted for her not out of courtesy, but because they simply didn't register her presence enough to stand firm, and she found the private restroom at the end of the east hallway, the one she'd identified during the cocktail hour, because identifying exits was something she did automatically now. She locked the door. She reached under the carefully constructed Spanx situation that her dress required and retrieved a small, matte black device from the slim holster she wore against her left hip. It didn't look like a phone exactly. It was thicker than a phone. Military-grade satellite encryption, the kind that didn't route through any domestic carrier. She'd had it for 2 years. She'd used it exactly 6 times. She dialed. It rang once. Ariana. His voice was the same as it always was, low, unhurried, with that faint texture that came from a childhood spent between 2 languages, like gravel beneath still water. "I'm at my sister's wedding," she said. A brief silence, not an uncomfortable one. He was simply listening in the complete way that he did, which she had learned was rarer than it should be. I know where you are. Of course you do. She looked at herself in the mirror above the marble sink. Her lipstick was still perfect. She'd chosen it specifically to last. They're having a wonderful time. Tell me. So she told him, briefly. Without dramatics, without the catch in her voice, she could feel building somewhere behind her sternum. The toast, the bouquet joke, the 37 moments before it. The wine stain that Carter Dale had given her with a grin and an absent sorry about that. When she finished, there was another silence. Go back inside, Lucian said. Sit at your table. Wait for me. She exhaled slowly. Lucienne? Ariana. Just her name. But the way he said it had weight. How long did it take you to drive there? 20 minutes. Then sit for 20 minutes. Can you do that? She looked at her reflection again. The woman looking back at her had spent her whole life being told, in 1,000 different ways, that she was too much and not enough simultaneously. Too big. Not polished enough. Too smart for small talk and not decorative enough to be forgiven for it. Yes, she said. I can do that. Good. A pause. Ariana. Yeah. You're not invisible. You've never been invisible. They're just blind. She pressed the phone against her cheek for a moment longer than was necessary, then ended the call, tucked the device back into its holster, and squared her shoulders. She unlocked the door. She walked back out into the hallway, and then back through the laughing, sparkling, oblivious ballroom, and she sat down at table 14. Barbara was describing backsplash tile options to one of Preston's cousins. The elderly gentleman had woken briefly, located a dinner roll, and returned to sleep with it in his hand. Ariana folded her hands in her lap and waited. She was, above almost everything else in her life, very good at waiting, not the passive kind of waiting, not the kind where you go small and hold still and hope things get better on their own. The active kind, the kind where you see the shape of what's coming before it arrives, and you simply allow time to close the distance. 20 minutes. At table 1, Celeste was laughing, her new husband's arm around her, her diamond catching the light every time she turned her head. She looked the way she had always looked, effortless, radiant, adored, the product of 32 years of being treated like something precious. At table 14, Ariana watched the clock above the bar. 18 minutes. She thought about the files she had at home, the financial records she'd been hired to audit 6 weeks ago, routine due diligence work, the kind of assignment that came through her firm without anyone thinking twice about it. She'd taken it because she was good, and because the fee was fair, and because she never, not once in her career, chose assignments based on personal connection. She hadn't known, when she accepted the work, whose records they were. She'd figured it out on day 2. 19 minutes. The music changed, something slow and orchestral. A few couples drifted onto the dance floor. 20 minutes. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Not the main entrance, the service entrance, the large double doors that the catering staff had been using all evening. They opened with a sound that shouldn't have been audible over the music and the conversation and the 200 people filling the room. But somehow, it was. And the music stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The DJ, who had been positioned near the stage, had gone very still with his hands at his sides and his headphones around his neck. And he was looking at the doors the way you look at something when every instinct you have is telling you to be very, very quiet. The first 2 men who entered were simply dressed. Dark suits, no pocket squares, no tie pins, nothing decorative. And they moved with a specific kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with hurry and everything to do with purpose. They positioned themselves at the interior corners of the main entrance and stood still. Then 4 more. Then 6. They materialized at every exit Ariana had cataloged during cocktail hour, plus 3 she hadn't identified, which told her the room had been mapped considerably more thoroughly than she'd managed in an hour and a half of passive observation. The conversations in the room were dying, not all at once. In a wave, the way conversations always die when something is wrong. The tables near the doors first, and then spreading inward as people turned to look at what the people near the doors were looking at. Carter Dale, who had been building toward another punchline at the bar, stopped mid-sentence. Preston Whitmore III looked at the doors, looked at his best man, and for the first time all evening, the calculation behind his eyes flickered into something that looked remarkably like fear. Eleanor Hale put her champagne glass down. And then Lucian DeLuca walked in. He wasn't the tallest man in the room. He wasn't the most formally dressed, though his suit was the kind of suit that didn't need to announce itself because it already knew. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair silvering at the temples and the kind of face that carried its years without apology. And he moved through the silenced ballroom the way water moves through a channel it has carved for itself over time, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like there was nowhere else it had ever considered going. His eyes found Ariana at table 14 before he had taken 4 steps into the room. She had known, intellectually, that he was coming. She had made the call. She had waited the 20 minutes. But knowing a thing was coming and actually watching it arrive were different experiences. And for a moment, just the space of one breath, her composure wavered. Then she steadied. He crossed the room without looking at a single other person. Not Celeste, who had risen halfway from her chair. Not Preston, who was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. Not Eleanor, who had the frozen expression of a woman whose social calculations were failing to produce a result. He walked to table 14. He stopped in front of Ariana. And then, in front of 300 of New York's most powerful and most self-important people, Lucian DeLuca went down on one knee, took her hand in both of his, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The silence in the room was absolute. He looked up at her. His eyes were dark and very calm, the way deep water is calm. Not empty, not cold, just deep, with things moving underneath that you couldn't see from the surface. "I'm sorry I kept you waiting," he said, quietly. But in a room that silent, quiet carries. Ariana looked at him for a long moment. "You were exactly on time," she said. He rose, and he turned slowly, and he looked at the room full of people who had spent the better part of an evening amusing themselves at her expense. His gaze moved without hurry across the tables, the frozen faces, the champagne glasses half raised and forgotten. When he spoke, his voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "My name," he said, "is Lucian DeLuca." A pause that lasted just long enough. "I believe most of you already know that." No one answered. No one moved. "Good," he said. "Then we can skip introductions." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded card, which he handed to one of his men without looking at him, who handed it without expression to one of the venue's managers, who had appeared at the edge of the room, looking as though he deeply regretted every choice that had led to this moment. "The evening isn't over," Lucian continued, "but it's going to change direction. I need everyone to remain where they are." Carter Dale, from somewhere near the bar, said, "Now wait just a—" One of the suited men near the door turned his head and looked at Carter. Carter Dale did not finish his sentence. Ariana sat at table 14 and watched the room that had laughed at her an hour ago, the room that had watched her be humiliated and found it entertaining, begin to understand slowly and with gathering horror that the evening they had thought they were having was not the evening they were actually in. At the main table, Celeste's beautiful face had gone the color of old paper. Preston Whitmore III had his phone in his hand. He was staring at the screen with an expression that Ariana recognized immediately, because she had seen it on the faces of people during federal interviews. The expression of a man watching something he thought was safely buried beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to surface. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in that moment, across the glittering ruins of his perfect wedding night, he understood. She could see it happen, watch the comprehension arrive like cold water, that she had known. That she had been sitting at table 14 all evening, eating the food and absorbing the jokes and wearing the wine stain on her hem, and she had already known. The files were already submitted. They had been submitted 4 days ago. Ariana reached for her water glass and took a calm sip. Beside her, the elderly gentleman slept on, still holding his dinner roll, utterly undisturbed. And the wedding that had been built on lies, cruelty, and $80 million of other people's stolen money began, very quietly, to collapse. The first person to move was Eleanor Hale. Not toward Lucian, not toward Ariana. She moved toward the bar, which said everything you needed to know about Eleanor's hierarchy of needs in a crisis. And she picked up a champagne flute that wasn't hers and drained half of it in a single pull before setting it back down with a click that was too loud for what the gesture was supposed to look like. Her husband Richard stood 3 feet behind her and said nothing. He had the expression of a man who had married into a performance he'd never fully understood and was only now, at this late hour, beginning to appreciate the full scale of what he'd signed on for. Celeste had not sat back down. She was standing beside her chair at the main table with both hands pressed flat against the white tablecloth, and she was looking at her sister with an expression that had started as disbelief and was curdling, visibly, into something uglier, something that had always been there, Ariana thought, just usually better dressed. "What is this?" Celeste said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone managing a scream. Lucien didn't look at her. I was standing slightly to Ariana's left, which put him between the main table and table 14 in a way that didn't look deliberate but absolutely was. And he was scanning the room with the unhurried attention of a man taking inventory. "Celeste." Ariana said her sister's name the way you say the name of something hot before you touch it, carefully. "Sit down." "Don't tell me to sit down at my own wedding. I'm not telling you anything about your wedding." Ariana set her water glass down. "I'm giving you advice." The distinction landed. Celeste blinked, and for a fraction of a second something moved across her face that might, in different circumstances, have been fear. Then Preston was on his feet. He came around from behind the main table with his hands slightly raised, palms out, which was a gesture people made when they wanted to appear reasonable and unthreatening, and which usually meant the opposite. He was a good-looking man. Ariana had always acknowledged that, the way you acknowledge a fact that has no particular bearing on anything important. Strong jaw, expensive haircut. The body of someone who paid a trainer. But his face right now was doing things that his careful grooming had never prepared it to do. "Mr. DeLuca," Preston said, and his voice came out steadier than his eyes looked. "I don't know what Ariana has told you." "She didn't tell me anything tonight," Lucien said pleasantly. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." Preston stopped walking. "Excuse me?" That wasn't a suggestion. Something passed through the room, not sound, more like the absence of sound, the total collective cessation of breathing, of the ambient noise that 300 people produce just by existing in the same space. Preston Whitmore III stood in the middle of it, and his jaw worked once, like he was testing words before committing to them. He sat down. Carter Dale, at the bar, had been inching toward the service exit for the past 90 seconds. He'd moved maybe 4 feet. One of Lucien's men, without any visible communication from anyone, simply repositioned himself 2 feet to the left. Carter stopped inching. "Here's what's going to happen," Lucien said, and his voice had the specific quality of a man who was used to saying things once. "There are some people in this room who owe someone an apology. That's going to happen first. Then we're going to have a conversation about why this evening's celebration may have been premature." He paused. "Everyone understand?" No one answered. "Good." Eleanor set her champagne flute down again. This time the click was softer. She was composing herself. Ariana could see it happening, the machinery of her mother's social self-preservation clicking back into gear after the shock had loosened it. Eleanor Hale had been navigating rooms like this for 40 years. Not rooms with armed men at the doors, perhaps, but rooms where the power had shifted unexpectedly and survival required rapid recalibration. "Lucien," Eleanor said his name with the careful warmth of a woman who was deciding in real time that she had always liked him. "I don't know what our Ariana has." "Our Ariana," Lucien repeated. A very small silence. "Your Ariana," he said again, and the 2 words in repetition had acquired something they hadn't had the first time. An edge. Not loud, just sharp. The same Ariana who was seated at table 14 tonight. The seating arrangement was the same Ariana, he continued, as if Eleanor hadn't spoken, who your other daughter publicly humiliated with a microphone in front of 300 people 40 minutes ago. Eleanor's composure held. "That was a joke. Celeste didn't mean—" "Mom." Ariana's voice was quiet. "Stop." Eleanor looked at her daughter, really looked at her, the way she rarely did, the kind of look that required acknowledging that another person was fully present and fully real. And something shifted in her face. Not remorse. Eleanor was not built for remorse, but something like the recalculation you do when you realize the terrain has changed and the map you've been using is wrong. "We're not doing this here," Eleanor said, and her voice had dropped to the low private register she used for family corrections. The one that meant, we will handle this quietly and privately because that is what we do. We are doing this here, Ariana said, because that's where you chose to do it. Ariana, I swear to... You laughed. Ariana said it without heat. That was the thing that made it land. The complete absence of heat in her voice. The total calm of someone who has been holding a specific sentence in a specific place for a very long time and is finally setting it down. You had a champagne glass in your hand and you laughed. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. Across the room, at table 14, the elderly gentleman stirred in his sleep and murmured something unintelligible and resettled. Barbara, beside him, had not moved in several minutes. She was holding her dessert fork with both hands like it was something she could protect herself with. Lucian turned then, for the first time since he'd entered, and looked directly at Carter Dale. Carter Dale was a large man who had always moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never, not once, been made to feel small. His size had done a lot of that work. The rest had been done by money, by the particular social armoring that came from knowing the right people and making the right entrances and never, not seriously, being held to account for anything. He was being held to account now. You. Lucien said it without any particular emphasis, just the word. Carter's chin came up. It was an involuntary thing, the physical grammar of a man whose instinct was to puff up when challenged. I don't know who you think you spilled wine on her dress. Lucien said it like he was reading from a list. During cocktail hour, you turned around fast with a glass in your hand and caught the hem of her dress, and then you said... He paused and looked at one of his men near the door, who produced a small device and pressed something on it, and from somewhere a voice came, tinny and small but perfectly audible in the silent room. Carter Dale's voice. Oh, did I get you? And then, already turning away, already finished with the moment, sorry about that. The recording ended. Carter's face had gone from red to a particular shade of gray that Ariana associated with men who had just understood the depth of a situation they'd been treating as shallow. That was an accident, Carter said. His voice had lost about 60% of its volume. I know it was an accident, Lucien said. What wasn't an accident was the toast. Carter said nothing. I want you to go over there. Lucien tilted his head slightly toward where Ariana was seated. I want you to stand in front of her, and I want you to explain to the 300 people in this room why you thought what you said was funny. I'm not going to, Carter. Preston's voice came from the main table, sharp, almost panicked. Just do it. Carter Dale looked at his best friend. Something passed between them, some code or history or silent argument. And then Carter moved, slowly, away from the bar. He walked to table 14 with the specific gait of a man who was measuring every step, and he stopped in front of Ariana. He was big. Up close, he was bigger than she'd remembered from cocktail hour. He was looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between resentment and shame, and the resentment was winning, which told Ariana everything she needed to know about whether this moment was actually changing anything in Carter Dale's understanding of himself. But she let him speak. What I said, Carter started and stopped and tried again. The comment I made during the toast, it wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry. He said it to the floor. Not to her. Look at her, Lucien said. Carter looked up. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing that eyes do when the mouth is saying one thing and everything behind the face is saying another. Say it again, Lucien said, to her face. The silence stretched. I'm sorry, Carter said. To her face, with his eyes on hers. Ariana looked at him for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't give him the absolution he was angling for. She could see him waiting for it, the slight forward lean that meant he expected to be released from this moment as soon as she made an acknowledging gesture. Okay, she said, just that. Okay. Carter blinked. Okay? You can sit down, Carter. He stood for another moment, uncertain. Okay wasn't the response the social grammar of apology had prepared him for, and the uncertainty showed. And then he turned and went back toward the bar and didn't pick up his drink. Ariana looked at Lucien. He looked back at her, one brief nod. Then he turned to the main table. Mrs. Hale, he said, your daughter has something she'd like to say. Celeste's head came up. I have absolutely nothing. Celeste. Richard Hale spoke for the first time since the evening had changed. He had a voice that his daughters had always associated with the infrequent moments when he was actually present, actually paying attention, rather than managing himself from behind a layer of distraction and mild whine. His voice now was tired, old tired, the weariness of a man who had spent 30 years looking the other way and was beginning to feel the accumulated weight of it. Just do it. Celeste stared at her father. Please, he said, and that word from Richard Hale landed in a way that the command hadn't. Ariana heard it and felt something complicated happen in her chest. Not softness, exactly, but the ghost of what softness used to feel like before it got trained out of her. Celeste stood. She was still beautiful. The dress still caught the light. Her hair was still perfect, but her face was doing something Ariana hadn't seen on her sister's face since they were children. Since a specific November afternoon when Celeste was 9 and had broken something irreplaceable and had stood in the kitchen knowing she couldn't fix it. She walked to table 14. She didn't look at Lucian. She didn't look at their parents. She looked at Ariana with the direct, slightly desperate gaze of someone who has run out of deflections. The thing I said. She stopped, started again. The bouquet joke. Her voice was not steady. For once, the performance had a crack in it. It was cruel. I knew it was cruel when I said it, and I said it anyway because… She stopped again. Her hands were clasped in front of her, which was a gesture Ariana remembered from their childhood. Celeste always clasped her hands when she was genuinely frightened. Because everyone was looking at me and I wanted them to keep looking at me, and you were just… You were there. And you were easy. Easy, Ariana repeated. I know. Celeste's voice dropped. I know how that sounds. You've always been very good at knowing how things sound, Ariana said, less good at caring. Celeste's eyes went bright. Not the bright of tears about to fall, more the bright of tears being held back with considerable effort. I'm sorry, Ariana, that's all I can… Okay, Ariana said. The same word. The same flat, undramatic delivery. Celeste waited. The apology was supposed to unlock something, some door between them that could lead somewhere warmer. Celeste's expression was asking for it with everything except words. Ariana did not open the door. Okay, Celeste said, and there was something almost wounded in it. You should go back to your table, Ariana said. You have guests. Celeste stood for one more second. Then she turned and walked back to the main table, and she sat down, and she did not look at Preston, and Preston did not look at her, which was the first thing about their marriage that was completely genuine. The room had been reconfiguring itself this entire time. The initial shock had settled into something different, not calm, exactly, but the focused, tightly held attention of people who understood they were present at something that mattered and were trying to figure out which way it was going to fall. Some of the guests had begun the very quiet social calculation of whether to align themselves with power, with Lucian's obvious and present authority, or whether loyalty to the Whitmore family required something. The Whitmore family's allies kept looking at Preston for a signal, and Preston kept staring at the tablecloth. Marcus Whitmore, Preston's father, had been silent in the corner of the main table since Lucian arrived. He was 71 years old, barrel-chested, with white hair and a face built for projecting absolute confidence in boardrooms. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had been sitting with his hands folded on the table and his eyes tracking Lucian with the careful, measuring attention of a man who was used to playing long games and was trying to determine the shape of this one. Lucian looked at him now. Marcus, he said. Marcus Whitmore looked back. His expression didn't change. Lucian. You've been quiet. I've been listening. That's wise. Lucian moved toward the main table for the first time, crossing the room with that same unhurried certainty. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. We should have a conversation. I imagine we should. Marcus's voice was smooth. Whatever he was feeling, he was excellent at not feeling it out loud. Though I'm not sure this is the venue. The venue was your choice, Lucian said. You picked tonight. You just didn't know it. Marcus's eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, to Preston. A fast movement, the kind you make when you're checking something, and the fact that he made it told Ariana that Marcus knew exactly what Lucian meant. And the fact that he'd looked at Preston told her who Marcus was more worried about protecting. Not the money, the son. Preston felt his father's eyes and looked up, and between them passed something fast and silent and loaded with the specific weight of a secret that two people have been carrying together for long enough that they don't need words for it anymore. "Dad," Preston started. "Not now," Marcus said, quietly, firmly. "Your father's right," Lucian said to Preston. "Not now." He turned and addressed the room again, with the ease of a man who had never in his life lost the thread of a conversation. "I want to introduce someone to those of you who don't already know her." He walked back toward table 14, and as he did, his eyes found Ariana's, and they held a question. She understood the question. She gave him the smallest nod. "Ariana Hale," Lucian said, "is one of the most gifted forensic accountants in this country. She has worked with the FBI, with the SEC, with the Southern District of New York. She is, to be precise, the person that people call when they need to find money that other people have worked very hard to hide." The room had reconfigured again. The shift was subtle but seismic. Eyes were moving from Lucian to Ariana, reassessing her with the abrupt recalibration that happened when a person you'd categorized one way turned out to exist in an entirely different category. Barbara, at table 14, had put down the dessert fork. 6 weeks ago, Lucian continued, she was hired to conduct due diligence on a series of investment funds. He paused. "I believe several of you in this room have money in those funds." The quality of the silence changed. It went from the silence of people watching something happen to someone else, to the silence of people who have just realized they might be in the thing too. A woman at table 5, 60s, silver-haired, the kind of woman whose jewels had been inherited rather than purchased, turned to the man beside her and said something barely above a whisper. He shook his head once. She gripped his arm. Preston was on his feet again. You can't just—" His voice had climbed. The control was going. "This is my wedding. You're standing in my wedding, and you're—" "Sit down, Preston," Marcus said. Low, lethal. Preston did not sit down. "These are baseless." "They're not baseless," Ariana said. She said it simply. "The way you state a fact." She didn't raise her voice to match Preston's. She didn't have to. Every head in the room turned to her. She stood up from table 14, straightened her dress. The wine stain on her hem caught the light when she moved, that small burgundy shadow on the fabric, and she looked at it for a fraction of a second before she looked up. "The Whitmore Family Investment Partners Fund," she said, "has been operating as a Ponzi scheme for 11 years. The last verified external audit, a real one, not the ones filed with the SEC, was in 2013. Since then, money coming in from new investors has been used to pay returns to existing investors, while the actual capital has been redirected through 4 shell companies registered in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Cyprus." She spoke with the same tone she used in federal depositions. Clear, exact, no performance. "The total amount misappropriated is approximately $80 million. The accounts were frozen by federal order 4 days ago. I have the documentation." The room did not erupt. It did something more terrifying than erupt. It went perfectly, absolutely still. The stillness of a large number of people processing the same information at different speeds and arriving, one by one, at the same destination. The silver-haired woman at table 5 said very quietly, "Oh my God." Her companion was already on his phone. Then 3 more people had phones out. Then 7. The room began to fracture along the lines of who had money in the Whitmore funds and who didn't, and the fracture was visible. You could see it happening, the guests separating into those who were afraid and those who were watching the afraid ones with the complicated mix of relief and guilt that comes from narrowly avoiding a thing. Preston had gone white. Not the dramatic white of a movie. The ugly, uneven white of blood draining from a face that doesn't know where else to put it. "You—" He was looking at Ariana. "You did this. How long have you—" "Since day 2 of the audit," she said. "You were at this wedding. You sat at that table and you—" "I sat at table 14, Ariana said, "because that's where your family put me. And yes, I was here." She held his gaze. "I didn't come here tonight to do this, Preston. I came because she's my sister, and I still, for reasons I genuinely cannot explain, show up for people who don't show up for me." A pause. "The audit was already done. The filing was already submitted. I couldn't undo it if I wanted to, which I don't." Preston turned to Celeste. And that was the moment, the exact, precise moment, when Celeste Hale understood what she had married. Not the understanding that comes slowly, that builds over years. The immediate, cold, floor-dropping understanding that hits when all the information that was always there suddenly assembles into the shape it was always going to be. She was looking at her husband, and her husband was looking at her, and neither of them was reaching for the other. And in the space between them was 11 years of stolen money and 4 shell companies, and the specific, nauseating reality that the man she had married her into this life had never once looked at her the way Lucien DeLuca had looked at Ariana when he walked through those doors. "Preston," Celeste said. Her voice was almost nothing. "Tell me this isn't—" "Celeste." His voice had changed. The polish was gone. Underneath it was something younger and raw and genuinely frightened. "I need you to trust me right now. Tell me this isn't what she said it is." He opened his mouth. He closed it. Celeste looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at her mother. Eleanor was holding the champagne flute again, but her hand wasn't steady, and the champagne was moving slightly in the glass. "Mom," Celeste said, "did you know?" Eleanor set the glass down. "Celeste, this is not— Did you know?" Eleanor Hale looked at her younger daughter, the beautiful one, the one she had spent 30 years treating like an investment in a better version of the family story. And she said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Celeste's face did something complicated and private and entirely without audience, or it would have been without audience anywhere else. But they were still in a ballroom full of 300 people, and the cameras that the wedding photographer had been using all evening were still technically present, though the photographer himself had the look of a man who desperately needed professional guidance on what to do with the footage he'd been collecting for the past 30 minutes. Marcus Whitmore stood up. He was the only person in the room who stood up as if he meant to, as if standing was a strategic act, which for him it always had been. He was 71 years old, and he had built, or rather stolen, an empire, and he had watched it start to come apart in the last 8 minutes with the controlled interior fury of a man who was already thinking about how to salvage what remained. He looked at Lucien. "Whatever you think you're doing," Marcus said, and his voice had the low, resonant authority of a man who had never been spoken to the way Lucien had spoken to him, and who intended at some point when the mathematics were more favorable to revisit that. "You've made your point." "I haven't made any point," Lucien said. "I just wanted to have dinner with my—" He paused and glanced at Ariana, and something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile. "With Ariana." Marcus looked at Ariana then. Really looked at her with the assessing eyes of a man who was now performing a very rapid and very belated revaluation of a person he had completely failed to see. "You could have come to us," Marcus said to her. "Before the filing, we could have—" "No," Ariana said. "Just no. Nothing else." Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked back at Lucien. "My lawyers will be in touch." "I'm certain they will," Lucien said pleasantly. Marcus Whitmore picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, nodded at his wife, who had been so still for so long that she looked like she'd been painted there, and walked toward the door. 2 of his associates rose from their tables and followed without being asked. At the door, one of Lucien's men didn't step aside. Marcus stopped, looked at the man, looked at Lucien. "Marcus," Lucien said. "One thing." Marcus turned. "The accounts in Cyprus." Lucien's voice was perfectly pleasant. "The ones under the name Meridian Coastal Holdings." A pause that landed like a stone in still water. "Make sure your lawyers know about those specifically. The federal attorneys are going to ask." The color left Marcus Whitmore's face for the first time all evening. Because Meridian Coastal Holdings was not in Ariana's documentation, she hadn't found it. Lucien had. Marcus Whitmore walked out of the ballroom, and this time when he moved differently. The walk of a man who has just discovered that the hole is deeper than he measured and the bottom is still falling. Ariana turned and looked at Lucien. He met her eyes. "You didn't tell me about Cyprus," she said. "You didn't need it for the filing," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was always this with Lucien, this awareness that he operated in registers she didn't have complete access to, that the parts of his world she understood were a fraction of the parts that existed. She had accepted this, mostly, in the way you accept a large and complicated fact that you have decided is worth the complexity. But moments like this one reminded her that the complexity was real. "Is there more I don't know?" she asked. He considered the question honestly, which was one of the things she valued most about him. He didn't give her automatic reassurance. He looked at what she'd actually asked and answered it. "Yes," he said. She breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Old habit. "Okay," she said. The room around them was fracturing further. People on phones, people moving toward doors. The silver-haired woman at table 5 now openly weeping while her companion spoke rapidly into his cell. Celeste sitting at the main table, not looking at Preston. Preston sitting across from her, not looking at her. Richard Hale standing beside his wife with his hand on her back in a gesture that might have been comfort or might have been the only thing keeping Eleanor upright. And at table 14, the elderly gentleman finally, fully woke up. He looked around the room. He looked at the armed men by the doors. He looked at the weeping woman at table 5. He looked at the untouched plates and the abandoned champagne flutes and the general atmosphere of elegant catastrophe. He looked down at the dinner roll still in his hand. He took a bite of it thoughtfully. Then he looked at Ariana, who was the closest person to him, and he said, "Did I miss dessert?" "Yes," Ariana said. He nodded slowly. Fully. Figured. He took another bite of the roll. "Anything else I should know about?" Ariana looked at the room, at Celeste, who was finally, quietly, beginning to cry. At Preston, who was staring at his phone with the hollow expression of a man watching his life's architecture disassemble in real time. At Lucien, who was speaking quietly to one of his men near the service entrance. At her parents, who were having the first honest conversation she'd ever seen them have, in low voices, without performance. "A few things," she said. The gentleman nodded, chewed, looked at what remained of his dinner roll with the philosophical calm of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that there was very little point in rushing toward information that was going to find you anyway. "I'll wait," he said. And somewhere outside the estate, on the long curved driveway lined with imported flower arrangements and perfectly placed lanterns, the headlights of 3 unmarked federal vehicles turned off the main road and began their approach. The wedding was not over. It had simply stopped being a wedding. The federal vehicles didn't use sirens. That was the first thing Ariana noticed when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened again, and 3 men in dark suits walked in with credentials already out, moving with the specific contained urgency of people who had been waiting in a parking lot for a signal and had finally received it. No sirens, no announcement. The absence of noise was its own kind of statement. The statement that said we don't need to announce ourselves because the situation is already ours. The lead agent was a woman. Late 40s, short brown hair, the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that it wasn't going to waste energy on expressions that didn't serve a purpose. She held her credentials up as she walked, not toward Lucien, not toward Marcus Whitmore's empty chair, but directly toward the center of the room, where she stopped and looked around with the evaluating calm of someone taking a room's temperature. Her name, Ariana would learn in the next 30 seconds, was Special Agent Dana Reeves. She'd been with the Financial Crimes Unit for 19 years. She had the kind of institutional knowledge that lived in the body, in the way she positioned herself so she could see every exit, in the way her eyes moved across the room, categorizing people before she'd said a single word. She looked at Lucien first. He looked back. Something passed between them that wasn't warmth and wasn't hostility, more like mutual acknowledgement. 2 people who had existed in adjacent territories long enough to have developed a working understanding of each other's edges. "Mr. DeLuca," Reeves said. "Agent Reeves," Lucien said. "There's food if you're hungry." "We ate." She looked at Ariana. "Ms. Hale." Agent Reeves. Ariana had worked with Reeves twice before. Once on a municipal bond fraud case that had taken 14 months and resulted in 6 convictions. Once on something she still couldn't discuss. She trusted Reeves the way she trusted most federal agents, conditionally, professionally, with the clear-eyed understanding that their interests overlapped without being identical. "We need Preston Whitmore," Reeves said. Preston, still at the main table, had heard his name. He was already standing, already starting the particular physical language of a man preparing to negotiate. Hands slightly forward, shoulders open, the body saying, "I am cooperative and reasonable," while the eyes said something else entirely. I want my lawyer, Preston said. That's your right, Reeves said. We'll wait while you call. I'm calling him now. Great. She turned back to Ariana without waiting to watch Preston dial. Your documentation, the filing you submitted 4 days ago. Yes. There's a problem. The sentence landed the way sentences land when they've been carried across a room specifically for you. Ariana felt it in her sternum before she processed the words. What kind of problem? She said. Reeves looked briefly at Lucian, then back at Ariana. Can we find somewhere quieter? The venue manager, who had been hovering at the edge of everything all evening with the expression of a man watching his career dissolve, stepped forward immediately and offered the private dining room off the east corridor. He said it with the excessive helpfulness of someone who understood that helpfulness was currently his only available currency. Ariana followed Reeves into the corridor. Lucian came without being asked, which Reeves noted and didn't object to. The private dining room was small. Round table, 8 chairs, a sideboard with untouched petit four. Reeves closed the door. She didn't sit. She put both hands on the back of one of the chairs and looked at Ariana with the direct, undecorated expression of someone delivering information that they'd rather not be delivering. The audit documentation you submitted, Reeves said. The financial records for Whitmore Family Investment Partners. Chain of evidence. I followed protocol exactly, Ariana said. I always follow. I know you do. Reeves's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone managing a situation carefully. The records themselves aren't the issue. It's the source. She paused. Where did you get the initial files? The ones that started the audit? Ariana felt something shift in her chest. A small tectonic movement. They were provided by the client who hired me. And who was the client? Cavendish Partners, LLC. They engaged my firm 6 weeks ago for standard due diligence on a potential acquisition. Cavendish Partners, LLC, Reeves said, was dissolved 16 days ago. The room was very quiet. Ariana heard the sentence. She processed it. She took it apart and looked at the pieces and put it back together and looked at it again, because surely she had assembled it wrong. That's not possible, she said. I have a signed engagement letter. The engagement letter is real, Reeves said. The company was real 6 weeks ago, when they hired you, but Cavendish Partners was a shell. It existed for approximately 8 weeks, and its sole purpose was to initiate this specific audit. She paused. Someone set this up, Ms. Hale. Someone who knew you, knew your reputation, knew you'd find what was in those files, and knew you'd report it correctly. The audit itself is solid, your methodology is solid, but the originating client is gone, and the defense is going to argue that the entire investigation was manufactured, that someone with an agenda hired you specifically to destroy the Whitmore family. Ariana stood in that small dining room with its untouched petit fours and its 8 empty chairs and felt the ground perform a very slow, very complete reorganization beneath her feet. Who? She said. The word came out stripped of everything except the question itself. Reeves looked at her for a moment, then she looked at Lucian. Ariana turned and looked at Lucian. He was standing near the door with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in the careful neutrality that she had learned to read over 2 years. The neutrality that was not the absence of expression, but the management of it. The deliberate containment of something that, uncontained, would change the shape of the room. She looked at him. He looked back. Lucien, she said, quietly. Ariana, did you set up Cavendish Partners? The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. She counted them. Old habit. Yes, he said. She had known the answer before she asked the question. She had known it the way you sometimes know things that you've been not looking at for a while. The knowing was already there, already formed, just waiting for the question to give it shape. But knowing and hearing were still different things, and hearing it in his voice, in this small room, did something to her that she hadn't prepared for. You hired me, she said. Cavendish hired you, he said. I never... Don't. The word came out flat and hard. Don't do the technical distinction thing right now. Don't. She breathed. You knew what was in those files before I opened them. I knew there was a problem, he said. I didn't know the scale. But you knew enough to set up a company specifically to put the files in front of me. I knew you'd find whatever was there, he said, and I knew you'd handle it correctly, which you did. And the wedding? Her voice was steady. She was working very hard to keep it steady. My sister's wedding. You knew she was marrying into this. I suspected. He said it without flinching, which she had always respected and was currently finding difficult to be near. 3 months ago, I started seeing money move through channels that connected to the Whitmore family. I didn't know about the wedding until when? A pause. Until about 2 months ago, he said. 2 months. She ran the arithmetic automatically, the way she always did. 2 months ago, she had told him about the wedding. A conversation on the phone, late on a Tuesday, complaining about the seating chart her mother had sent her that placed her at table 14. She had told him, and he had listened with the complete attentive listening that she valued, and he had said nothing about what he already knew. You let me go to that wedding, she said. I didn't let you do anything. You're not someone You let me sit at that table, she said, and her voice did the thing it hadn't done all evening. It cracked. Not completely. Just at the edge. Just at the seam. Just enough for what was underneath to be audible. You let me sit there and get laughed at and get wine spilled on my dress. And you knew the whole time why I was there and what was going to happen. And you... She stopped, swallowed, reorganized. Was the phone call your idea? Was I supposed to call you? No, he said. And this landed differently than the other answers because it had an immediacy to it, a directness that the others had been slightly more managed. That was yours. When you called me, I hadn't planned to come tonight. I was going to let the federal process. But I called you, she said. You called me, he said. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that Reeves, who had been very professionally still in the corner of the room, shifted her weight slightly from one foot to the other. The thing that was hardest was this. She still believed him. About the call. About not planning to come. She could read people. She was very good at reading people. And what she was reading from him right now was complicated and layered and contained something she was going to have to spend considerable time with. But the part about the call, she believed, which somehow made the rest of it worse, not better. Because it meant that she had, without knowing it, inserted herself into the center of something he had constructed around her. She had thought she was making a choice, and she had been, but the frame of the choice had been built by someone else. My case, she said to Reeves. My filing. What happens to it? Reeves pulled out a chair and sat down, which meant this was going to take a minute. The documentation itself is solid. Your methodology is beyond reproach. But Cavendish being a shell gives the defense a narrative that this entire investigation was orchestrated by a third party using you as a legitimate-seeming instrument to take down a competitor. She folded her hands on the table. We can work around it. It'll take longer. The case won't fall apart. But it gets messier, and messier means slower, and slower means some of the Whitmore money that's currently frozen might find ways to move through legal challenges before we can... Which accounts specifically? Ariana said. Sorry? Which accounts are most vulnerable to moving during the delay? Her voice had leveled out. The crack had sealed itself over, the way these things did. Not healed, just sealed, just enough to function. She was already in work mode. She couldn't help it. Work mode was where she went when everything else became too complicated to inhabit. If I know which ones, I might be able to... Ariana. Reeves said her name with a kind of professional gentleness. That's not your job right now. My job is finding money that people are trying to hide, Ariana said. That's literally your job as a forensic accountant, not as someone personally connected to the subjects of the investigation. Reeves looked at her steadily. You understand the problem. Ariana understood the problem. She had always understood the problem, from the moment she'd realized whose files she was looking at on day 2 of the audit, and she had done what the ethical guidelines required. Disclosed the conflict of interest to her firm, documented it, been assured that the personal connection was sufficiently distant to proceed. A sister's future in-laws. Not a direct financial relationship, not a prior professional connection. Disclosed and cleared. But Lucian was different. Lucian was not a sister's future in-laws. Lucian was not a disclosed and cleared distant connection. Lucian was the man who had set up the company that hired her. Does my firm know? She said. Not yet, Reeves said. That's a conversation you're going to need to have. Tonight? Soon. Ariana sat down. She hadn't meant to sit. She'd been standing, and then she was sitting, and the chair was there to receive her, which was useful because her legs had decided to have a quiet opinion about the last 10 minutes. She put both hands flat on the table in front of her, the way she did when she was working through a particularly tangled set of numbers. Palms down. Pressure applied. The physical grammar of stay here, stay present, worked the problem. The Whitmore defense, she said, if they use the Cavendish angle, who's their attorney? Stephen Marsh, Reeves said. Ariana closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, opened them. Of course it is. Stephen Marsh was the best criminal defense attorney in New York for financial cases. He was also someone who had tried, twice, to discredit her testimony in prior federal cases. He had not succeeded, but he had been thorough, and he had been creative, and he had the specific talent of taking something true and surrounding it with enough manufactured ambiguity to make juries uncertain. He was going to take the Cavendish connection and build a cathedral out of it. She looked at Lucian, who was still standing near the door. He had not moved during any of this. He had stood there and taken the full weight of her questions and Reeves's information and had not retreated, not deflected, not performed any of the self-protective behaviors she'd seen other people perform in difficult moments. Why the Whitmores, she said. Not what did they do. She already knew what they did. Why now? Why this way? He looked at her for a moment, measuring something she couldn't quite name. Then he said, Meridian Coastal Holdings. She waited. Marcus Whitmore has been using that account for 18 months to clean money for 3 organizations that are competing with legitimate interests of mine, he said. Not illegal interests, legitimate businesses. 3 of them were approached for investment last year by front companies connected to Whitmore money. 2 of them accepted. When I traced where the investment capital actually came from, he stopped. Chose the next words carefully. The Whitmore family's financial crime is real, Ariana. It was always real. I didn't manufacture the crime. I just made sure the right person found it. The right person, she repeated. Yes. The right person being your... She stopped. They had never used a specific word for what they were to each other. She had never pushed for the word because she had always been cautious with words that carried that kind of weight. But the absence of the word right now felt like its own kind of answer to something. The right person, Lucian said, being the best forensic accountant I know, who I trust completely, whose work would be beyond reproach. He paused. I didn't consider that Cavendish would become a vulnerability. That was a mistake. I should have... Yes, she said. You should have. He accepted that without argument. Reeves was watching this exchange with the careful neutrality of a federal agent who was filing everything she observed in a mental folder labeled complicated and would deal with the contents at a later date. I need to step outside, Ariana said. She said it to no one in particular and to both of them simultaneously. She stood, and her hands came off the table, and she walked to the door, and Lucien stepped aside without being asked. She walked back into the east corridor. The corridor was empty except for a catering staff member who was standing against the wall with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had decided the best strategy for this evening was to be architecturally indistinct. Ariana walked past him to the end of the corridor where there was a window that looked out onto the estate's side garden, and she stood there and looked at the dark shapes of the topiary and the string lights that someone had spent hours arranging to be romantic and that now just looked like evidence of a plan that had failed. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She stayed like that for 30 seconds, maybe 40, long enough to feel the cold against her skin and let it do its anchoring work. She thought about the audit. She thought about 6 weeks of her life, the late nights, and the meticulous documentation, and the specific, grim satisfaction of watching a financial crime reveal itself in the numbers with the slow inevitability of a bruise coming to the surface. She had done the work correctly. She knew she had. Every step, every decision, every disclosure, correct. The work was real. The crime was real. $80 million stolen from hundreds of investors who had trusted the Whitmore name, some of them people who couldn't afford to lose what they'd lost. The work was real. But she had been, without knowing it, a piece in someone else's arrangement. That was the thing she was sitting with. Not the legal complexity. She'd find a way through the legal complexity. She always did. Not even the anger at Lucian, which was real and present and would need its own time. The thing she was sitting with was the specific private humiliation of realizing that in 2 years of what she'd believed was a relationship between equals, she had been, in at least this one significant instance, maneuvered. She straightened up from the window. She looked at her reflection in the glass, dim, partial, just the shape of herself against the dark garden outside. She thought about what the elderly gentleman had said. "I'll wait." Just like that. Patient and philosophical about the fact that information was going to arrive regardless. She turned around. Celeste was standing at the end of the corridor. Ariana hadn't heard her coming. That was unusual. She was normally very attuned to approaching footsteps, another professional reflex. But Celeste had apparently mastered the corridor in bare feet, heels in hand, her wedding dress slightly gathered at the front so she wouldn't trip on the hem. She looked terrible. Not in the way that ugly crying looked terrible, in the way that shock looked terrible, the flatness of it, the specific emptiness of a face that has processed too much in too short a time and has temporarily suspended all editorial judgment about what it's showing. She stopped when she saw Ariana. For a moment, neither of them moved. "I didn't know," Celeste said. Ariana looked at her sister. "About the money," Celeste said. "About any of it. Preston never... I had no idea what his family..." She stopped, pulled in a breath that had a ragged edge to it. "I need you to know that." "Okay," Ariana said. "That's not enough," Celeste said. "You keep saying okay and it..." She made a gesture with the hand that was holding her heels, something frustrated and helpless. "It sounds like you don't believe me." "It sounds like I heard you," Ariana said. "Those are different things." Celeste's jaw tightened. "You've been waiting for this. Admit it. You've been waiting for something to happen that proved..." "I haven't been waiting for anything," Ariana said, and meant it. "I have been surviving. There's a difference." The corridor was quiet. From somewhere behind the ballroom doors, muffled voices, Reeves's agents beginning the specific procedural choreography of a federal action, the sounds of documents being requested, of chairs scraping. "He's not going to stay with me," Celeste said. She said it without drama, which made it worse than drama. Just the flat acknowledgement of something she'd already calculated. "Preston, even if it somehow doesn't, he was never..." She stopped. "I think I knew. Not about the money, but I think I knew he was calculating something. I just thought what he was calculating was us." Ariana looked at her sister in the dim corridor light. Celeste was 32 years old and had spent every one of those years being the beautiful one, the chosen one, the one that things fell into order around, and she was standing in a hallway in bare feet on her wedding night, with her mascara 3 hours past its tolerance and the calculating man she'd married currently being read his rights in the next room. Ariana did not feel triumph. She had thought, in the abstract, in the long private inventory of things she might feel if something like this ever happened, if the universe ever redistributed its evident favoritism, that she might feel something adjacent to satisfaction, to vindication. The specific relief of a person who has been told repeatedly that the world works a certain way, finally seeing evidence that it doesn't. She felt none of that. What she felt was tired and sad. The particular sad that comes not from your own pain, but from standing next to someone else's and recognizing in it the same shape as your own, just wearing different clothes. "Celeste," she said. Her sister looked at her. "Whatever happens with Preston, whatever happens with the Whitmores and the money and all of it..." She paused. "You're going to need an attorney, a good one, not connected to Preston's family, someone who can establish very clearly what you knew and when before this goes any further." Celeste blinked. Are you helping me right now?" "I'm telling you the correct next step," Ariana said. "Whether you take it is up to you." "After everything Celeste's voice went rough. "You sat in that ballroom all night and I know what you did," Ariana said. "I was there." A pause. "Get the attorney, Celeste, tonight if possible, before anyone from the federal team asks you anything." She walked past her sister. She had almost reached the ballroom doors when she heard Celeste say, quietly, "Why?" Ariana stopped, didn't turn around. "Because you're still my sister," she said. "I don't know what that means anymore, but it's still true." She pushed through the doors. The ballroom had transformed in the 30 minutes she'd been in the corridor. The catering staff had retreated to the perimeter. Reeves's agents were stationed at 4 points around the room. Preston was seated in a chair apart from the main table with an agent standing nearby. not restraining him, just present. And he was talking on his phone with the specific hunched intensity of someone delivering very bad news to a lawyer at an hour when lawyers prefer not to receive news. Eleanor Hale was at table 1 with her husband, and they were holding hands. Ariana couldn't remember the last time she'd seen them hold hands. It looked like something they were trying rather than something they'd practiced. Lucien was standing near the center of the room, talking to one of his men, and he looked up when Ariana came through the doors. He watched her cross the room toward him. She walked without hurry, without performance, in the direct, practical way she moved when she was operating entirely inside a decision she'd already made. She stopped in front of him. "The Meridian account," she said. "The Cyprus money." "Yes." "How much documentation do you have?" He studied her face. "Enough." "Enough for what?" "For whatever you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that Agent Reeves has a problem with the Cavendish chain of evidence, and that if the defense uses that to slow the case down, some of the Whitmore money moves. And that if the Meridian account is documented separately, from a source that isn't me, isn't my audit, isn't anything connected to Cavendish partners, it creates a second evidentiary thread that doesn't have the same vulnerability." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about restructuring the prosecutorial case." "I'm talking about making sure $80 million worth of stolen money doesn't disappear because of a procedural vulnerability that could have been avoided." She held his gaze. "I need to know what you have on Meridian. All of it. Not the version you've already decided I need. Everything." He looked at her for a long moment. "If I show you everything," he said, "it changes some things." "I know. Between us," he said, "and otherwise." "I know that too," she said. He reached into his jacket and removed a small encrypted drive. He held it between two fingers. He didn't hand it to her yet, just held it in the space between them, the way you hold a thing when you're acknowledging that handing it over is a different act than not handing it over. "This isn't just the Whitmores," he said. "I figured. There are names on this drive," he said, "that are going to make the Whitmores look like a minor problem." "Lucien." "Yes." "Give me the drive." He placed it in her hand. It was small, lighter than it should have been for what it apparently contained. She closed her fingers around it and felt the cool metal against her palm and stood in the wreckage of her sister's wedding with the weight of something enormous and irreversible in her hand, and understood with complete bone-level clarity that the life she'd been living before tonight, the careful, controlled, documented, protocol-following life, was no longer available to her. She had been a forensic accountant who worked federal cases and kept her personal life separate, and was very good at finding other people's secrets. She was still going to be all of those things, but she was going to be them differently now, from a different position, with different information, inside a different set of facts about the world and her place in it, and the man standing in front of her whose full understanding of those facts she was only now, holding this drive, beginning to approach. She looked up at him. "How many names?" she said. And somewhere outside, the unmarked federal vehicles repositioned, and inside the ballroom, Preston Whitmore ended his phone call and put his face in his hands. And the night that had started as a wedding continued its transformation into something that none of the people inside the estate were going to spend the rest of their lives forgetting. "Enough," Lucien said, "to change everything." She closed her hand tighter around the drive. "Then we'd better start," she said. The drive was the size of a thumbnail. Ariana held it in her closed fist and walked to the nearest empty table and sat down and opened her laptop bag. She had carried it in from the car during cocktail hour because she carried it everywhere, always, the same way other women carried lipstick or breath mints. And she set the laptop on the table and looked at the drive in her palm for exactly 3 seconds before she plugged it in. Lucien sat down across from her. He didn't look over her shoulder. He looked at the room, watching the agents, watching Preston, watching the exits, while she worked. That was something she had learned about him early. He understood the difference between hovering and being present. Most men she'd known in her life had not understood that difference. The drive mounted, 12 folders. She opened the first one. She had been doing this work for 11 years. She had seen financial crime in forms that most people didn't know existed, the elegant kind that lived in the gaps between regulatory jurisdictions, the crude kind that was just theft dressed in corporate language, the kind so baroque in its construction that it took a team of 6 people and 14 months to fully diagram. She had sat across tables from men who had stolen retirement savings and college funds and medical settlements, and looked at her with the complete serenity of people who believed their intelligence exempted them from consequence. She had never in 11 years felt her hands go cold looking at a screen. They went cold now. "Lucien," she said. "I know," he said. He was still watching the room. "How long have you had this?" "Parts of it, 2 years. The full picture." A pause. 7 months. 7 months, she ran it. 7 months ago, she had been sitting across from him at a restaurant in the West Village, and he had been asking her about a case she was wrapping up, and he had been entirely, attentively present, and he had known, even then, that there was a drive sitting somewhere with 12 folders on it that contained what she was looking at right now. She pressed that down, filed it, later. "This isn't just the Whitmores," she said. "I told you that." "You told me there were names." She turned the laptop slightly so the screen faced him. "You didn't tell me one of the names was Hargrove." For the first time all evening, something moved across Lucian's face that was not managed, a brief, unguarded tightening around the eyes. "You know Hargrove." "District Judge Raymond Hargrove," Ariana said, "signed the account freeze order on the Whitmore funds 4 days ago." She looked at him. "The same Raymond Hargrove who, according to folder 7 on this drive, has been receiving quarterly payments from a Meridian subsidiary since 2019. The silence between them lasted about 2 seconds. "Yes," Lucian said. "He signed the freeze," she said. "He froze the accounts. Did he know?" "I don't know what he knew about Meridian when he signed it," Lucian said. "I know what he knows now." "What does he know now?" "That the drive exists." The cold in her hands moved up her arms. "Lucien." She said his name the way you say the name of a situation that is getting away from you. "If Hargrove knows this drive exists, he doesn't know you have it. He will." She pushed back from the table slightly, not retreating, thinking. "If Reeves moves on the Whitmore case and Marsh starts pulling at the Cavendish thread and Hargrove is watching..." She stopped, put it together, took it apart, put it together again. "The freeze order. If Hargrove has any reason to revisit the freeze order, he won't." "How do you know that?" Lucian looked at her then, directly, fully, with the particular attention he reserved for moments when he was about to say something that he intended to say exactly once. "Because Raymond Hargrove is currently more afraid of me than he is of the Whitmore family." She absorbed that. "Is that a permanent condition," she said, "or a temporary one?" "Everything is temporary," he said. "The question is how long temporary needs to last." She looked back at the screen. Folder 9. She opened it. She wished she hadn't opened it. "Lucien." "Which one?" "Folder 9. She turned the laptop again. He looked. His face did the thing it had done at Hargrove's name, the brief, involuntary tightening, but this time it held, stayed contracted. The face of a man looking at something he had hoped, perhaps, she would take longer to reach. "Senator Callaway," she said. "Dennis Callaway, Senate Finance Committee." Her voice was very even. "Who is currently overseeing the federal investigation into financial fraud in the private investment sector." She waited. "The investigation that Reeves's unit reports to." "Yes," Lucian said. "He's on this drive." "Yes." "How deep?" "Deep enough," Lucian said, "that if he finds out the drive exists before we can structure how it comes out, the investigation gets buried. Reeves gets reassigned. The Whitmore case gets killed at the federal level, and Marcus Whitmore walks out of this with a fine and an apology." Ariana closed the laptop. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the closed lid. The drive was still in the port. She could feel it there the way you can feel a splinter. Small, insistent, the specific pressure of something that doesn't belong inside the thing it's in. "You have a judge and a senator," she said, "on a drive. And you've had this for 7 months." "Yes. And you've been sitting on it." "I've been deciding how to use it," he said. The distinction was careful, intentional. "Same thing." "Not quite." He leaned forward slightly. "If this comes out wrong, if it comes out in a way that looks like it's coming from me, that looks like a criminal operator using compromising information to attack elected officials, it doesn't land as justice. It lands as a hit. Everything on that drive gets discredited. Hargrove claims extortion. Calloway claims fabrication. The Whitmore defense uses it to paint this entire investigation as organized crime warfare dressed up as federal prosecution. He paused. It has to come from somewhere clean. She understood what he was saying before he finished saying it. From me, she said. From you. She stood up. She needed to be standing. She picked up the laptop and held it against her chest and walked 4 steps away from the table and stood facing the wall and breathed. The sounds of the ballroom pressed against her back. Agents' voices, the muted conversation of 300 people who had been told to remain and were beginning to test the edges of that instruction, the specific acoustic signature of a large space in which something irrevocable was in progress. She thought about her career. 11 years of meticulous, documented, defensible work. A reputation that federal agencies returned to because they knew what they were getting. Someone who followed the protocol, who maintained the chain of evidence, who never let personal interest contaminate professional judgment. She had built that reputation the hard way, the slow way, in an industry that had not initially been welcoming to someone who looked like her and came from where she came from, and she had built it by being, above all things, clean. If she walked Reeves's team through the contents of this drive, the first question Reeves would ask was where it came from, and the answer was Lucian. And the answer being Lucian meant that everything on the drive entered a legal gray zone from which the defense would spend years trying to extricate it. If she didn't walk Reeves through it, a judge and a senator who had been stealing stayed in place, and they used their positions to bury a case against people who had stolen $80 million, and everyone went home. She turned around. Agent Reeves was standing across the room, watching her. Not approaching, just watching, with the patient attention of a woman who was also doing math. Ariana walked toward her. "I need 5 minutes," Ariana said. "You have 4, Reeves said. "Preston's lawyer just arrived." Ariana looked toward the ballroom entrance. A man in a dark overcoat was moving through the doors. Late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who was very expensive and knew it. He went directly to Preston without looking at anyone else in the room. Stephen Marsh. He was here faster than she had expected, which meant he had been close, which meant someone had called him before the federal vehicles arrived. She looked at Lucian. He was already looking at Marsh. "I was already on his way," Lucian said, low. "Someone in this room made a call." Ariana scanned the ballroom. 300 people. Most of them had been compliant, frightened, focused on their own positions. But 300 people was 300 phones, and the agents hadn't confiscated phones because they didn't have legal authority to confiscate phones. And someone, one of the Whitmore family's allies, one of the investors who stood to benefit from the case being complicated, had made a call the moment the federal vehicles arrived. Marsh reached Preston. He bent and said something in Preston's ear. Preston's posture changed, the hunched, collapsing posture of a man under pressure becoming something more organized, more protected. Marsh had that effect. He was very good at making people feel like the walls were back up. Then Marsh straightened and looked across the room. He found Ariana immediately, as if he'd known exactly where she would be. He looked at the laptop in her arms. He looked at her face. Something moved in his expression. Quick, professional, the rapid calculation of a man who was very good at reading rooms and was reading this one. He excused himself from Preston and walked toward her. "Ms. Hale," he said. His voice was warm. It was always warm. Warmth was a professional tool like any other. "I was wondering if you'd be here tonight." "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Interesting evening." He glanced around the ballroom with the mild curiosity of a man at a cocktail party. "I understand congratulations may be premature." "The Whitmore family's investment practices are a matter of federal record," she said. "I don't think this is a conversation we should be having." "Probably not." He looked at the laptop again, just briefly. "I do want to say, for what it's worth, that whatever role you played in the investigation, I assume a professional one, entirely by the book. I have enormous respect for your work. I always have." "Thank you," she said, flat. "It would be a shame," he said, still warm, still mild, "if questions about the origin of certain evidence complicated that reputation." He smiled. "Not that I'm suggesting anything has. I just, well, these situations can become messy, as I'm sure you know." He knew about Cavendish. He already knew, which meant someone had told him. Not tonight. He'd arrived too fast, too prepared to have learned it tonight. Someone had told him before tonight. Someone who knew about Cavendish Partners and its dissolution and what that dissolution would mean for the evidentiary chain. She looked at him and kept her face entirely still and said, "Is there something specific you wanted to say to me, Stephen?" The warmth in his expression didn't change. Just that I hope the evening resolves itself without causing anyone unnecessary damage, particularly people who've worked as hard as you have to build something worth protecting. He nodded once, pleasantly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." He walked back toward Preston. Ariana stood holding her laptop and understood, with the specific clarity that came from being very good at pattern recognition, that Stephen Marsh had just delivered a threat and made it sound like concern, and that the threat was real, and that he had delivered it now, in the middle of a federal action, in a room full of agents, because he was confident enough in the leverage he had to make it not matter where he said it. She walked to Reeves. "I need to show you something," she said, privately. Reeves looked at her. Something shifted in the agent's expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the confirmation of a suspicion she'd been managing. "The private dining room?" "Yes." They moved toward the corridor. At the doors, Ariana glanced back. Lucian was watching her. His face was composed and still, and his eyes asked a question she didn't have the answer to yet. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she went through the doors. In the private dining room, she set the laptop on the round table and opened it and pulled up folder 9 first. She turned it toward Reeves. Reeves looked at the screen. She was very still for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Where did this come from?" "I'm going to need to answer that carefully," Ariana said. "Yes," Reeves said, "you are." "The documentation itself, I'm not asking about the documentation." Reeves pulled her eyes from the screen and put them on Ariana. "I'm asking about the source. Because if the source is who I think it is, you need to understand what you're putting on the table right now, not just professionally, personally." "I understand." "Do you?" Reeves's voice was not unkind, but it had shed the last of its professional softness. This was the voice of someone speaking plainly, because plainly was all that was left. "If Calloway is on this drive, and I'm looking at it, so he is, and this drive came from where I think it came from, then the moment I take this into evidence, Ariana, you become the link between a federal investigation and a criminal operator. That is not a misdemeanor problem. That is a career-ending, potentially criminal liability problem. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" "Yes," Ariana said. "Then tell me it came from somewhere else," Reeves said. "Tell me you found it in the Whitmore records. Tell me it showed up in the Cavendish files. Give me something I can work with." The room was very quiet. "I can't tell you that," Ariana said. Reeves put both hands on the table. She looked at the screen for a long moment, then looked away from it, at the wall, at the middle distance of someone working through something that had several bad solutions and no good ones. "Then we have a problem," Reeves said. "We have a problem either way," Ariana said. "If this comes in through me and it's complicated, it's complicated. If it doesn't come in at all, you have a judge who's compromised, and a senator who's compromised running oversight on a case involving the people who are compromising them." She leaned forward. "How does that end, Dana?" Reeves closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. "It ends badly," she said. "Then we figure out how to bring this in," Ariana said. "We figure out the cleanest possible path from this drive to a courtroom that doesn't run through me in a way that destroys either of us. That's what we're going to do right now, in this room, tonight." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you're asking," Reeves said. "Yes." "You know what it costs." "Yes." "Even if we manage it, even if we find the path, you're not going to come out of this the way you came in." Reeves said it gently, which was its own kind of hard. "The person you were when you walked into this wedding is not the person who walks out." Ariana looked at the screen, at the numbers and the names and the 11 years of careful, documented, defensible work that had led her to this table in this room on this night. "That person," she said, "was sitting at table 14. Reeves held her gaze for another moment. Then she reached into her jacket and produced her own phone and made a call. 2 words, when it connected, "Bring Kowalski." She ended the call and looked at Ariana. "Kowalski is my deputy. He's been with FinCrime for 22 years, and he knows every procedural angle this side of the Atlantic." She pulled out a chair. "We're going to need all of them." Ariana sat down. She opened the laptop fully, angled it for both of them to see, and pulled up folder 1. She was going to walk Reeves through all 12 folders systematically, in the order that built the clearest narrative, with the same methodical attention she brought to every piece of work she'd ever done. She had done this kind of work 100 times. She had never done it with this much at stake. Her hands were steady. She noted that with a kind of detached surprise. After everything, the toast, the bouquet joke, the wine stain, Lucian's confession, Marcia's threat, Reeves's warning. Her hands were completely steady on the keyboard. She had always been, above all things, very good at the work. Outside, in the ballroom, the sounds shifted. A sudden rise in voices. Then a sharp, distinct sound. Not a shout, not quite, but the specific vocal register of someone who had reached the edge of their capacity for containment. Then other voices, layered, urgent. Ariana looked toward the door. Reeves was already moving. They went back into the corridor and through the ballroom doors, and the first thing Ariana saw was Preston Whitmore standing in the center of the room with Stephen Marsh's hand on his arm, and Marsh was saying something low and firm directly into Preston's ear. And Preston was not listening, because Preston was looking at his phone with an expression that had gone past fear into something rawer and less managed. He looked up and found Ariana across the room. "You filed 4 days ago," he said. His voice was too loud. The whole room could hear it, and the whole room had gone still again, the way it kept going still when the temperature changed. 4 days ago, 2 days before the wedding. You already knew when you came to the rehearsal dinner. His voice was climbing. Marsh was still gripping his arm. You sat at our rehearsal dinner and you already knew what you were going to do, and you— "Mr. Whitmore," Reeves said, sharp, command register. She was there. Preston wasn't looking at Reeves. He was looking at Ariana. His face was doing something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, and was the specific, ugly combination of both that happened when a person realized they had been witnessed in something they thought was private. She sat there and she looked at my family and she— Preston. Marsh's voice, low and final. Stop talking. Preston stopped. Not because of Marsh, but because of what he saw on Ariana's face, which was something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something quieter and more permanent than either. She looked at him the way you look at something you've already finished thinking about. He sat down. Marsh looked at Ariana over his client's head. The warmth was still there. The professional warmth that never left. That was structural rather than emotional. But underneath it, in the set of his jaw, was something else. The look of a man who was revising his assessment of the board. "We'll be speaking again soon," he said to her. "I imagine we will," she said. She turned back toward the corridor. Reeves was 2 steps behind her. Kowalski, a broad, quiet man in his 50s who had arrived through the service entrance without Ariana noticing, was already in the private dining room, and when she came back through the door, he had his own laptop open and was looking at the drive with the practiced, clinical attention of someone who had spent 22 years looking at exactly this kind of thing. "Folder 9, Reeves said to him. He found it, opened it, read for 30 seconds. Then he looked up at Ariana. "Is this current?" "As of 7 months ago." "And the payment structure in folder 7? "Continuous," she said, "quarterly. The last one I can confirm is—" She leaned over and pointed to a line item. "There." Kowalski looked at Reeves. Something passed between them, the shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to have a language that lived below words. "There's a way," Kowalski said. "Tell me," Reeves said. "Financial Intelligence Unit," he said. "Independent of the FinCrime Division. Independent of the investigation. If this information is received by FinCrime as a separate incoming tip from an independent analyst." He looked at Ariana. "Not you, not DeLuca. Someone clean who can be documented as the receiving party." "Who?" Reeves said. "Bannerman," Kowalski said. Reeves made a sound that was not quite a word. "He's retired," Kowalski said. "Private consultant. He's done independent analysis for Treasury 3 times in the last 4 years. His intake would be completely separate from this investigation." Clean chain. "Bannerman hasn't taken a case in 18 months, Reeves said. "He'll take this one," Kowalski said. He looked at the screen again. "When he sees what's in folder 9, he'll take this one." Reeves looked at Ariana. "Does this work for you?" Ariana understood what she was being asked. Not is this logistically acceptable. She was being asked, "Can you live with this?" Can you hand this to someone else and watch someone else bring it home and not have your name on the final product of 11 years of work that led to this table? She thought about table 14. She thought about the elderly gentleman with his dinner roll. Yes, she said. Reeves nodded. She picked up her phone. At that precise moment, the private dining room door opened. Not a knock, not a request. It opened, and standing in the doorway was Eleanor Hale. She had fixed her hair. Her lipstick was fresh. She had performed, in whatever bathroom she'd found in the past 20 minutes, a rapid restoration of the version of herself that she presented to the world, and she stood in the doorway of the private dining room with her hands clasped and her chin at the precise angle that she used when she was about to conduct a very important negotiation. She looked at Reeves, at Kowalski, at the laptops on the table. Then she looked at Ariana. "I need to speak with my daughter," she said. "Alone." Reeves looked at Ariana. Ariana looked at her mother. Eleanor Hale had spent 34 years managing Ariana, not loving her. Or not only that, the accounting of Eleanor's feelings was more complicated than a simple deficit, but managing her, moving her to table 14, smoothing her edges, containing her in the frame of the family story in a way that didn't interrupt the more important narrative of Celeste's ascent. Eleanor had done this with such fluency and for so long that she probably didn't fully separate the managing from the loving anymore. She was doing it now. The posture, the fixed lipstick, the chin angle. She was doing it in a room full of federal agents with a judge and a senator's financial crimes open on a laptop screen, and some part of Ariana, the part that had been shaped by 34 years of being managed, felt the old familiar pull. The gravitational tug of the story Eleanor had always told about their family, which required certain things from Ariana and certain silences. She felt it. She did not move toward it. "This isn't a good time, Mom," she said. Eleanor took one step into the room. "Ariana, I need you to understand." "I do understand," Ariana said. "I've always understood." She kept her voice level. "Go back to Dad. I'll come find you when this is done." "When this is done," Eleanor said, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite a plea, but was as close as Eleanor Hale was physically capable of coming to one. "There may not be anything left to—" "Mom." The word came out with a weight in it that surprised even Ariana. Not harsh, not angry, just final. The weight of a thing that has been decided at a level below words. "Go back to Dad." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Her hands were still clasped. Her chin was still at its careful angle. But something behind her eyes was doing a slow, reluctant revision. Some long-held calculation being forced to accommodate new variables. She stepped back. The door closed. Reeves was already on her phone. Kowalski had begun typing. The drive was still in the port, its light blinking steadily. Small, red, the calm and indifferent pulse of something that contained enough information to end careers and begin prosecutions and reroute the lives of people in this building and people in buildings they'd never visited and people whose names Ariana was only now beginning to learn. She sat back down. She pulled folder 11 onto the screen. She hadn't looked at 11 yet. She opened it now. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Reeves." Reeves looked up from her call. Ariana turned the laptop. Reeves looked at the screen. She listened to whatever was being said in her ear. She said into the phone, "Hold on." She took the phone away from her face and looked at the screen and looked at Ariana and said very quietly, "Is that name what I think it is?" "Yes," Ariana said. Reeves put the phone back to her ear. "Kowalski," she said, not into the phone but across the table, her voice dropping to the register she used when things had crossed a threshold she hadn't anticipated. "We're going to need more than Bannerman." Kowalski looked at the screen. He looked at Reeves. "How much more?" he said. And Reeves said the name of the agency she was calling into the phone. And it was not an agency that Ariana had expected, and the room felt like it contracted slightly around that name, like the walls had taken a breath, like the whole careful structure of what they'd been building in the last hour had just been handed a load. It hadn't been designed to carry and was deciding, right now, whether it was going to hold. Ariana looked at folder 11. She looked at the name. She had sat at table 14 all evening. She had been laughed at and wine-stained and moved to the perimeter of a room full of people who had decided she didn't matter. She had made one phone call and set in motion something that had moved through this wedding, like a tide moving through a carefully arranged decorative shore, taking the arrangement apart, piece by piece, with the complete indifference of something that was always larger than what it was moving through. She had done that. And now she was looking at a name in folder 11 that was going to make everything that had happened tonight look like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. And she felt, for the first time since she'd sat down at table 14, something that was not tiredness and not sadness and not anger. She felt the specific, clarifying electricity of understanding exactly what you're inside of. The work, she thought. Stay in the work. She looked at Reeves, who was still on the phone, whose face had gone to the flat professional mask that meant everything underneath it was moving very fast. She looked at the drive, still blinking in the port. She put her fingers on the keyboard. And outside the private dining room, through the corridor and through the ballroom doors, in the wreckage of a wedding that had been built on stolen money and cruelty and the absolute conviction of certain people that they were untouchable, Preston Whitmore reached across the table toward his wife, and Celeste Hale looked at his hand and did not take it. The name in folder 11 was Thomas Vane. Ariana sat with that for a moment the way you sit with a diagnosis. Not the first second, when the word is still just a sound, but the second when the meaning arrives and rearranges everything it touches. Thomas Vane was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He was also, according to the third document in folder 11, a signatory on a series of wire transfers routed through a Luxembourg holding company that connected, through 4 intermediary entities, to the same Meridian Coastal Holdings account that had been paying Raymond Hargrove since 2019. He was the prosecutor's prosecutor, the man who had built the Southern District's Financial Crimes Division into the most feared prosecutorial unit in the country. He had given speeches about institutional integrity. He had been on the cover of 2 national magazines. He had, 14 months ago, personally called Ariana to thank her for her work on a bond fraud case that had resulted in 8 convictions. She had kept that voicemail. She deleted it now. Mentally. Permanently. Reeves was still on the phone. She had moved to the corner of the room, and her voice had dropped below audible, and her back was to the room, and her free hand was pressed flat against the wall beside her, which was the gesture of a person who needed something solid to push against while the thing they were hearing tried to move them. Kowalski was looking at folder 11 with the expression of a man doing very rapid math and not enjoying any of the results. "How long has Vane been on this drive?" he said. He wasn't asking Ariana exactly. He was asking the room. "Folder 11 was last modified 8 months ago," Ariana said. She checked the metadata. "Created 14 months ago." 14 months ago. 3 weeks after Vane called to thank her for her work. She put that somewhere and closed the door on it. "This is why the drive was sitting," Kowalski said, quietly, almost to himself. "You can't touch Vane through FinCrime. FinCrime reports up through the Southern District. You bring this to the wrong person, and it goes directly to the man it's about." "Which means the Whitmore case," Ariana said, "was always going to hit a ceiling. The moment it got big enough to threaten Calloway and Vane, yes." Kowalski looked at her. "Someone has been very carefully building toward a moment where enough of the structure was visible at once that you couldn't dismember it piece by piece, where it had to come out whole or not at all." Ariana thought about 7 months. About Lucien sitting on this drive for 7 months. Not from indecision. She understood that now, with a clarity that had not been available to her an hour ago. From patience. From the specific architectural patience of a man who understood that timing was not just a tactical variable, but the variable on which everything else depended. He had been waiting for the right case, the right investigator, the right moment in which the structure was exposed enough that a single, clean, well-documented revelation would bring it down whole rather than giving it time to shed limbs and survive. He had waited for a wedding. Reeves ended her call. She stood in the corner for a moment with her hand still against the wall. Then she dropped her hand and turned around, and she looked like someone who had aged slightly in the last 4 minutes. "FBI," she said. "Public Corruption Unit. They're sending someone." She looked at her watch. 40 minutes. "Not internal affairs," Kowalski said. "No," Reeves said. "Public corruption has independent oversight. They report outside the Southern District." She sat down. She put both forearms on the table and looked at folder 11 and then looked at Ariana. "You understand that when public corruption walks into this building tonight, everything changes. The Whitmore case becomes secondary. The Whitmore case becomes the door that opened onto something else." I understand, Ariana said. Your involvement, Reeves started again. Your involvement in the originating audit, the Cavendish question, the source of this drive, all of that becomes part of a much larger investigation. You will be interviewed, repeatedly. Your firm will be investigated. Your relationship with DeLuca will be scrutinized in ways that... She stopped again. I need you to understand what you're choosing. You told me that in the ballroom, Ariana said. The person I was when I walked in isn't the person who walks out. I meant it professionally, Reeves said. I mean it more broadly now. Ariana looked at folder 11, at Thomas Vane's name in clean, unambiguous type, at the wire transfer documentation that was as clear and unequivocal as anything she'd ever seen in 11 years of looking at financial crime. No ambiguity, no interpretation required, just numbers moving in patterns that meant one thing and one thing only. She thought about the work, about the $80 million sitting in frozen accounts, and the hundreds of people who had trusted the Whitmore name with their retirement savings and their inheritances, about a judge who had signed a freeze order while receiving quarterly payments from the people being frozen, about a senator running oversight on an investigation into the people paying him, about a United States attorney whose entire public career had been built on prosecuting exactly the kind of corruption he was quietly participating in. She thought about Table 14. She thought about the elderly gentleman. Is the Bannerman approach still viable, she said, for the Callaway and Hargrove material? Kowalski and Reeves exchanged a look. Yes, Kowalski said. That chain stays clean regardless of what happens with Vane. Then do it, she said. Tonight, before public corruption arrives. Get the Callaway and Hargrove material into Bannerman's hands through whatever channel keeps it clean, and get it documented before anyone in the Southern District knows what's on this drive. If we move on that before briefing public corruption, Reeves started. Callaway sits on the Senate Finance Committee, Ariana said. He finds out public corruption is coming before the material is out of his reach, and that material disappears. So does Hargrove's. The Whitmore case survives Vane being removed from it. It does not survive Callaway killing the account freeze from the Senate side. She looked at Reeves. You know this. Reeves knew this. The calculation was visible on her face. The professional ethics of sequencing a disclosure against the practical reality of what happened if the sequence was wrong. 20 minutes, Reeves said to Kowalski. Get Bannerman on the phone. Kowalski was already dialing. Ariana pulled the drive from the port. She held it in her palm. Then she stood up and walked out of the private dining room and back into the east corridor. Lucien was there. He was standing at the end of the corridor near the window she had stood at earlier, and he was looking out at the estate's side garden the same way she had, at the string lights and the dark topiary shapes, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his back to the room. He heard her and turned. She walked to him and held out the drive. He looked at it, looked at her, didn't take it. It's yours, she said. It was always going to be yours, he said. That's why I made it. I know. She kept her hand extended. Take it back. Public corruption is coming in 40 minutes. If that drive is in my possession when they arrive, Ariana, take it back, Lucien. He took it. He held it for a moment in the way he'd held it when he gave it to her, acknowledging the weight of the transaction, and then it went into his jacket pocket and disappeared. They stood in the corridor with the sounds of the ballroom muffled behind them. Vane, she said. Yes. You knew he was on there. Yes. And you knew that meant this couldn't go through FinCrime, couldn't go through the Southern District. She watched his face. You needed it to go through someone with no connection to either, someone clean and credentialed and with enough federal history that their involvement would be bulletproof. She paused. Someone who, when public corruption asked how this came to their attention, could point to 11 years of documented, impeccable, independent work as the entire explanation. Yes, he said, very quietly. That's what I am to you, she said. In this context. That's part of what you are to me, he said. In this context. The distinction landed. She sat with it. It was not the same as saying that's all you are, and she was precise enough with language to register the difference, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the difference mattered. You could have told me, she said, 7 months ago, 6 weeks ago, at any point. If I told you, he said, you would have handled it the way you handle everything, correctly, completely, documented. and Vane would have seen it coming in time to bury it. He looked at her steadily. I needed it to arrive all at once. I needed tonight. You needed a wedding, she said. I needed a room full of witnesses, he said, and a reason you'd be there. She looked at him for a long time. The string lights outside the window threw a pale, intermittent light across his face. Not flattering, not designed, just whatever light happened to be there. He looked tired, she realized. Not the performance of tiredness, but the actual variety. The tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was now standing in a corridor waiting to find out if setting it down had been worth it. She understood, looking at him, that this was real. The complexity of it was real. The manipulation of it was real. And the thing underneath those things was also real. And she was going to have to live with all of it simultaneously because that was what real things required. I'm angry, she said. I know. I'm going to stay angry for a while. I know that too. And we're going to have a much longer version of this conversation, she said, when this is over. Yes, he said, we are. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the ballroom doors because there was still work to do, and the work didn't stop because a conversation needed finishing. She went back into the ballroom. It was almost 2 a.m. The formal arrangements, the flowers, the table settings, the carefully positioned candles that had mostly burned down to stubs, had acquired the specific melancholy quality of a celebration that had outlasted itself. The catering staff had long abandoned any pretense of service. The DJ's equipment stood dark and idle. 300 guests, many of whom had been told by agents they were free to leave, but that their contact information was required first, had sorted themselves into clusters of shared anxiety. The Whitmore allies in one corner, conducting urgent whispered conversations. The investors in another, phones perpetually raised. The people who had no financial connection to the Whitmores, and were therefore present simply as witnesses to something they would be describing at dinner parties for the next decade. Ariana found her father. He was at the near end of table 2, alone, without Eleanor, with a cup of coffee that the catering staff had apparently produced from somewhere, and that he was holding in both hands the way you hold something warm when you need the warmth more than the coffee. He was 70 years old and looked, tonight, like 70 years old, which was not something she always noticed. He usually looked managed, groomed. The man Eleanor had built to complement the version of the family she was presenting. Tonight he looked like himself, stripped of the complement function, and what was underneath was older and quieter and more genuinely human than she was accustomed to seeing. He looked up when she sat down. Are you all right? He said. Yes. She paused. Are you? He looked at his coffee. I don't know yet. He turned the cup slightly in his hands. I'm sorry, Ariana. She waited. The seating arrangement tonight, the way your mother... He stopped. Started again. I've been letting things happen for a long time. To you. Things I could have... He stopped again. He was not a man who was fluent in this kind of language. He had spent too many years in the managed version to be easy in the real one. I'm sorry, he said again. That's inadequate. I know it's inadequate. She looked at her father. This small, tired man who had loved her, she had always believed, in the limited way available to him. Limited not by the quantity of feeling, but by the architecture of the life he'd chosen, or been chosen into, which didn't leave much room for the feeling to move freely. Dad? She said. He looked at her. I know, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. His eyes went bright. Not crying, not quite, just the particular brightness of something that was close to the surface. He nodded once, looked back at his coffee. They sat together for a moment in silence that was not comfortable but was honest, which was its own kind of value. Then Ariana stood, touched his shoulder once, briefly, and moved on. She found Eleanor at the bar, not drinking, standing beside it, which was different. Standing with her arms crossed and her chin at its usual angle, but her eyes doing something they didn't usually do, which was looking at the room without calculation, just looking. Mom. Eleanor turned. She took in Ariana, the laptop bag, the wine-stained hem, the expression of a woman who had just spent 3 hours doing things Eleanor would never fully understand the shape of, and she said nothing for a moment. Your dress, Eleanor said finally. I know. The stain might come out if you soak it tonight. It was such an Eleanor thing to say. Such a perfectly, completely Eleanor response to the evening they had just lived through. Practical surface information deployed as emotional avoidance. Ariana had spent her whole life being frustrated by it. Tonight she found it almost tender. "I'll try," she said. Eleanor uncrossed her arms. She reached out and touched the sleeve of Ariana's dress, just briefly. A gesture that was nothing and everything simultaneously. "I have not," Eleanor said, very quietly, "been a good mother to you." Ariana held very still. "I don't know how to fix that," Eleanor said. "I don't know if it fixes." She dropped her hand. Her chin was still at its angle, but something underneath the angle had given way slightly. The way well-maintained things give way when the maintenance becomes too expensive. "But I wanted to say it while things are honest." Ariana looked at her mother. At the woman who had spent 34 years constructing a version of reality that had very little room for her in it, who had laughed at a microphone joke, who had put her at table 14, who was standing here at 2 in the morning saying, "I don't know if it fixes," with the specific courage of someone for whom honesty was not a natural language and who was trying to speak it anyway. "I know, Mom," she said. Eleanor nodded, smoothed the front of her dress, reassembled herself by degrees. "What happens now with the—" She gestured vaguely at the room. "That's being handled," Ariana said. "You and Dad should get an attorney, not connected to the Whitmores. Separate representation." "We don't have any—" "You don't need to have anything to need an attorney," Ariana said. "Get one. I can give you a name." Eleanor looked at her. "You would do that?" "Yes." Eleanor looked away, out at the room. Her jaw worked slightly, processing something. "Celeste," she said. "Celeste is handling herself," Ariana said. "For once." Eleanor absorbed that without objecting, which was itself a kind of shift. Ariana left her at the bar. She went to find Celeste. Celeste was in the main entrance hall, outside the ballroom proper, sitting on a bench near the coat check, with her heels on the floor beside her and her phone in her lap, and her wedding dress spread around her in a wide, elaborate pool of expensive fabric that no longer seemed to belong to the occasion it had been designed for. She had found tissues somewhere. Her face was blotched and raw and entirely without performance, and she looked, for the first time that Ariana could remember, like someone Ariana recognized. Not the Celeste who had taken the microphone, not the Celeste who had been built by 30 years of being treated like a trophy, just a 32-year-old woman sitting on a bench on the worst night of her life. Ariana sat down beside her. Celeste looked at her. "Did you call an attorney?" "Yes." A pause. "She's good. She'll come tonight." "Tonight. Before the federal team talks to you." "Yes." Celeste looked at her phone. Preston called. "Did you answer?" "No." She set the phone face down on her knee. I can't figure out if I'm more devastated about the marriage or about the money. What does that say about me?" "It says you're human," Ariana said, "and that you're in shock." "I loved him," Celeste said. It was a small sentence, and she said it small. "Or I thought I did. Or I loved what I thought he was. I don't—" She stopped. "How do you tell the difference between loving someone and loving the story you've built around them?" Ariana thought about the drive in Lucian's jacket pocket, about 14 months of a voicemail she'd just deleted, about 2 years of a relationship she was going to have to re-examine with the same methodical attention she brought to financial records, going back to the beginning and looking at what was there and what she'd missed and what she'd chosen not to see. "I'm not sure you always can," she said. "While you're inside it." Celeste leaned her head back against the wall. "I'm going to lose everything." "Not everything." "Most of it." "Yes," Ariana said. "Probably most of it." Celeste turned her head and looked at her sister. "That doesn't bother you." "It bothers me," Ariana said. "Just not in the way you're expecting." Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were raw and direct, and entirely without the usual filtering mechanism. "I've been terrible to you," she said. "For years. Tonight was the worst, but it wasn't. It wasn't separate from the years. It was just the loudest." "I know." "I don't expect you to—" "Good," Ariana said. "Don't expect anything right now. Get through tonight. Call the attorney. Answer the federal questions honestly and completely, and don't try to protect Preston because Preston will not be protecting you." She stood. The rest is a longer conversation. Is there going to be a longer conversation? Celeste asked. The question was very small, genuine. Ariana looked at her sister, at the raw, undefended face and the ruined dress, and the two women they had each become partly because of what they were to each other. I don't know yet, she said, but I didn't leave. She went back into the ballroom. 42 minutes after Reeves had made the call, two agents from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit arrived through the service entrance. They were quiet, professionally unremarkable, and they went directly to Reeves and Kowalski, and the three of them conducted a conversation in the corner of the private dining room that Ariana was not part of and did not try to be part of. She sat at table 14. The elderly gentleman was still there. He had acquired from somewhere a piece of wedding cake. The cutting had apparently happened earlier in the evening before everything changed, and a plate had survived. And he was eating it with the measured appreciation of a man who had decided the cake was the most sensible thing available to focus on. He looked at her when she sat down. Better? He said. She considered the question honestly. Different, she said. He nodded, took another bite of cake. Different is usually the best you can ask for on any given night. What's your name? She said. She realized she didn't know it. He had been beside her all evening, and she didn't know his name. Walter, he said. Walter Finch. He extended a hand with the formal, unhurried courtesy of an older generation. You're Ariana. How did you know? Heard your name said about 40 times tonight, he said, by various people, in various tones. He looked at the room, at the agents and the remaining guests and the guttered candles. You did something important tonight. I did several things tonight, she said. I'm still deciding which ones were right. Right. That's a reasonable position, Walter said. He ate the last of his cake, set the fork down with a small, precise click. My wife was at a table like this one, at our daughter's first wedding, the bad one. He looked at the tablecloth. Nobody came in to fix anything that night. She sat at her table until it was over and she drove herself home. He paused. She sat at table 17 for 30 years waiting for somebody to notice. I noticed too late. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad someone noticed tonight. Ariana looked at this old man who had slept through a federal operation with a dinner roll in his hand and woken up and eaten wedding cake while the room reconstructed itself around him, and she felt something move in her chest that was not the specific sealed-over thing from earlier, but something warmer and more open. Thank you, Walter, she said. He waved it off. The gesture of a man who gave things without keeping accounts. At 3:40 in the morning, Preston Whitmore was formally detained. Not arrested. Detained, pending the processing of documentation that Kowalski and Bannerman, who had arrived by video link at 2:30, had been assembling for the past hour. Stephen Marsh was beside him as they walked out, and Marsh's face was doing the particular, precise work of a man who had just discovered that the floor he'd been standing on was actually a trap door and was not letting that show in any way that could be photographed. Marcus Whitmore had not returned. His lawyers had called Reeves twice. She had returned neither call. Ariana watched Preston walk out through the main entrance with the same detached composure she'd felt since she sat back down at table 14. She waited to feel something more dramatic, triumph, or grief, or the particular complex emotion of watching your sister's life dismantle itself in real time. She felt instead the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 22 hours and had spent the last 6 of them doing the most consequential work of her life, and the specific quiet clarity that came on the other side of that kind of exhaustion when everything non-essential had burned away. She felt clear. She hadn't felt clear in a very long time. Reeves found her at table 14 at 4 in the morning. She sat down across from Ariana, which was not something Ariana had seen her do all night. The agent had been moving constantly, a function of her role, but now she sat and put her hands flat on the table and looked at Ariana with the eyes of someone who had also been awake for too long and had also burned through to something underneath. Bannerman is clean, Reeves said. The Callaway and Hargrove material is in his hands and documented. Public corruption has folder 11. The vain matter is, it's going to be a long road, she paused, but it's moving. The Whitmore investors, Ariana said. The account freeze holds. Marsh can challenge it, but Hargrove's signatory authority is already being reviewed, which means any motion he files goes to a different judge. She paused. The money is going to take time, but it's not going anywhere. $80 million, Ariana said. Most of it, Reeves said. The Cyprus accounts are more complicated, but most of it. Ariana nodded. Reeves looked at her. Your firm. I'll talk to them today, this morning. She looked at the window. Gray was beginning at the edges of the darkness outside, the specific gray that came just before anything that could be called dawn. I'll handle it. You may need to step back from active cases while the investigation. I know. It could be 6 months, could be longer. I know, Dana. Reeves was quiet for a moment. You built something solid tonight, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever the next months look like, what you built tonight is solid. What we built, Ariana said. Reeves accepted that with a small nod. What we built. She stood, straightened her jacket. She looked like someone at the end of a very long shift who was probably going directly from here to a debrief and would not sleep until sometime tomorrow. Get some rest, she said. The real work starts Monday. It started 6 weeks ago, Ariana said. It started, Reeves said, when someone put you at table 14. She walked away. Ariana sat alone at table 14 in the emptying ballroom. Walter Finch had gone. Sometime in the last hour, he had collected his jacket and his dignity and his philosophical relationship to the evening and departed, and she had not seen him go. The remaining guests were filing out by degrees, giving their contact information to agents at the door, with the careful compliance of people who had spent the last several hours recalibrating their understanding of what an evening out could cost. The flowers were still on the tables. They would be dead by tomorrow. The string lights were still on outside. She heard him before she saw him, the particular quality of his footsteps, which she had learned, which was something that happened without intention when you spent enough time paying attention to a person. He walked to table 14 and he stood there and he looked at the empty chair across from her and he said, May I? Yes, she said. He sat. They were both facing the empty ballroom, the dark stage, the guttered candles, the elaborate centerpieces that nobody had touched. Outside, the string lights had finally, in the last few minutes, gone dark. The venue's automated timer, indifferent to what had occurred inside. Kowalski's good, Lucian said. He's very good. Bannerman? Better than advertised. Good. He looked at the empty room. The Callaway material. Moving through clean channels. It'll hold. He nodded slowly. And Vane. Public corruption. It's going to be long, but it's moving. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're firm. I'll handle it. If you need, I'll handle it, she said. Not sharp, just clear. He accepted that. They sat in the emptying room and the silence between them was not comfortable and not hostile, and was the specific, honest silence of two people who have been through something and are sitting in the aftermath of it without pretending it's something other than what it is. The conversation we're going to have, she said. Yes. I'm not ready for it tonight. I know. But I'm not. She stopped. I'm not ending anything. I want that to be clear. That's not what the anger is. He turned and looked at her. What is the anger? She thought about it. The real answer, not the one you give when you're protecting yourself. It's the anger of someone who thought they knew the shape of the room they were in, she said, and found out the room was bigger than they thought. And some of the extra space was good, and some of it was built without telling me. Yes, he said, that's accurate. I needed you to know I know that, she said, accurately. I know, he said. She looked at the empty stage. The microphone was still there, the one Celeste had used for the bouquet joke, the one Carter Dale had used for his toast, still standing in the center of the stage in the abandoned ballroom at 4 a.m, like an artifact of something that had happened a long time ago. Celeste's attorney is good, she said. She'll be okay. Do you care? Not unkind, genuinely asking. Ariana thought about her sister on the bench with her heels off and her face raw. I don't know what I care yet, she said. I know I sat at her table tonight, when she needed someone to. That's a start. Lucian nodded. My parents need a referral, she said, for representation. They're not involved, but they'll need to document that. I'll have someone call them tomorrow. I'll do it, she said. I'll find someone. They should come from me. He looked at her. Okay. She thought about her father's hands around the coffee cup, her mother reaching out and touching the sleeve of her dress. The stain might come out if you soak it tonight. Not forgiveness, not repair. Just the beginning of something that might, over a long time and with considerable work, become something you could call a relationship. The wine stain was probably permanent. Some things were. She reached into her laptop bag and pulled out her notebook. The paper one, the one she carried for the moments when putting something on a screen felt like too much. And she wrote 6 numbers across the top of a blank page. The Whitmore case file reference number. The Meridian account number. The date of the last verified payment to Hargrove. The date on folder 11's creation. The date she had accepted the Cavendish engagement. Today's date. She looked at the numbers. The shape of the thing. In its simplest, most distilled form. 6 numbers that contained 11 years of her life in one night that had changed the shape of what came next. She closed the notebook. "I want to go home," she said. "I'll take you." "I'll drive myself," she said. "I drove myself here." He looked at her. "I know." "I want to drive myself home," she said. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Okay." She stood, she picked up her laptop bag and her notebook, and she straightened her dress, and she looked down at the wine stain on the hem. The one Carter Dale had left with his turned-around carelessness and his absent sorry about that. And she looked at it for a moment. She had spent the evening thinking of it as a mark, an injury. The first in the evening's long inventory of small and large humiliations. She looked at it differently now. It was just a stain. It had been there all evening while she did the most important work of her life. It had been on her hem when she held the drive, when she talked to Reeves, when she sat across from her mother and her father and her sister and said the things that needed saying with the steadiness she'd been building for 34 years. The stain had been there for all of it. She picked up her bag and walked through the ballroom, past the empty tables and the dead flowers and the dark stage, past the place where Lucien had knelt in front of 300 people and kissed her hand, past table 1 where her parents had held hands for the first time in years, past the service entrance where the federal vehicles had idled and where the night had finally, definitively, become something other than a wedding. At the door, one of Reeves's agents checked her name against a list and nodded her through. She walked out into the pre-dawn air. It was cold, colder than it had been when she arrived. The deep, clean cold of very early morning, the cold that belonged to the hour before anything started. The imported flowers lining the driveway had closed in the night. The string lights were dark. The armored SUVs were gone, leaving only the soft impressions their tires had made in the gravel and the particular quiet of a driveway that had contained a great deal of activity and now contained only her. She walked 2 blocks to where she had parked. She got into her car. She sat for a moment in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel and the laptop bag on the passenger seat and the notebook on top of it with its 6 numbers. The sky to the east had the very first suggestion of something lighter. Not light. Not yet. Just the memory of light that preceded it. She had been the person everyone looked past. She had been the name that got a laugh. She had been table 14. She started the car. The drive home took 23 minutes. She knew every turn by reflex, by the accumulated habit of the life she had built quietly and carefully in the margins of the story her family told about themselves. She drove without the radio. The city was almost silent at this hour. Not empty, it was never empty, but quieted. The particular quietude of a place that had been running hard all night and was now, briefly, catching its breath. She parked in her building's garage. She took the elevator up. She unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside and set her bag down on the table by the door and turned on the lamp in the living room, the small one, not the overhead, because the overhead was too much for 4 in the morning. She went to the kitchen and filled a glass with water and drank half of it standing at the sink. Through the window above the sink, the city was beginning its first tentative shift toward morning. Windows lighting up in other buildings, the distant rhythm of early traffic, the accumulated, enormous fact of 8 million people beginning to move. She set the glass down. She looked at her hands, steady, both of them, still, and she thought about Walter Finch and his wife at table 17 who had waited 30 years. She thought about Reeves saying what you built tonight is solid. She thought about Lucian's voice in the satellite phone at the beginning of the evening, low and unhurried. You're not invisible. You've never been invisible. They're just blind. She thought about the drive and the names and the work that was beginning Monday and the 6 months or longer of scrutiny and interviews and professional uncertainty and the long necessary conversation that she and Lucian were going to have and the longer, more uncertain reconstruction of what she and her sister and her parents were or could become. She thought about the stain on the hem of the dress she was still wearing. She went to the bathroom and turned on the water and soaked the hem in cold water the way her mother had told her to. It was 4:47 in the morning. She stood over the sink and held the fabric under the water and watched the wine loosen and pale at the edges. Not disappear, not completely, but change. Become something smaller than what it had been. Something the fabric could carry without being defined by it. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Lucian. 3 words. Drive home safe. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set the phone face down and turned back to the sink and kept working. Outside,